All right, hello everyone, and welcome to eGate's webinar series. We're kicking the webinar series off with a pretty broad discussion and continuation of something we did at our IFSA show. The goal for this is really to make sure that we've got a discussion forum set up with our clients and broadly for the industry where we feel like maybe there's some discussions that aren't necessarily happening that could be certainly around technology and data interchange and operations and how we all connect these things together in a positive way. There's also certainly a selfish element for eGate in all of this, which is we want to have a forum where we're interconnecting this pretty deeply with our roadmap and making sure that the products do in fact address what we see as client needs. So, in parallel with this, we're running a webinar series for our clients that's part of a larger user group. So if you're in that group, please let us know and we'll make sure you're getting the emails. Those topics will sort of address a similar and parallel topic set and be really focused on use of the products and how the products address some of these issues, and then continuing deeper into the discussion about how we can make sure the products address your needs. So from a format perspective, the goal here is really to have an open discussion. So if you have any questions or you want to jump in and talk about something while we're going, we're actually really welcoming of it. There's also a series of question and Q&A buttons you can see on your meeting burner screen. And you can use those freely, and we'll get to them at the end, or in the middle if you just jump in with them. So with that, I want to get started. Today we're going to talk a little bit about what we're calling sort of bringing the back office on board. We're trying to understand how back office functions in catering, operations, and in-flight planning, how we can improve and enable in-flight service, which we really see as a current battleground in the industry and a place where people are really working hard to compete. So with that, I'm going to kick off and ask Zenith Wheeler to start us off.
Okay. So the onboard customer is changing, it's evolving, and that's what we're focusing on today. And the changing and evolving customer is due to increasing use of technology. The customers are becoming more savvy as they check in using their cellular phones or as they're going on board web pages. They're becoming more aware of what's being offered on board. They're also increasing their expectations of what they expect to happen on board or a part of the onboard experience. Things like they know whether they're going to have a meal on board. They know whether or not there's going to be buy on board meals on board. They know what those meal selections are so they can make educated decisions about whether they're going to buy their meals inside the airport or whether they're happy with the selections that's happening on board the aircraft and they'll just wait till they get to their seat. So in the onboard services world, whether you work in the galley planning, whether you work in catering operations, whether you work in menu development or procurement, you're always going to get those emails or those phone calls that's requesting an update to this onboard experience. These changes can be anything from your rotables, your silverware, your plates, to food and beverage. So maybe you get a call from marketing. They're wanting to do a brand refresh. In the North American market right now, we have some updates happening with carriers updating their imagery. So they might be wanting to introduce some new colors, some new logos, some new designs into the onboard experience. So you might, the refresh could also have to do with localization of products. They might be looking for products that are part of the local community. These products may or may not have been suited to be on board. So you might be having to work with manufacturers to make them relevant to the onboard experience that you're looking for. Some other phone calls or updates to the onboard experience might just be part of a quarterly menu refresh, or maybe a monthly refresh, or maybe a 6-month refresh, depending on how often you change your menu. It just might be due to course of business. Other changes might be based on customer or crew feedback. Maybe you're getting feedback from your customers that this product just isn't satisfactory. Or maybe you're getting feedback from your crew members saying that you're using more of this product than you anticipated. Maybe it's exceeding the expectations and you need to increase the quantity. And while all of these changes, as part of the onboard team and onboard services team, you're wanting to get excited. It's a complete rebranding of the airline, or maybe it's a complete refresh of the brand menu selection. But it involves a 6-letter word. And that 6-letter word that we all hate to hear is the word change. It's going to be a change that will affect your menu team. It's going to be a change that's going to affect your procurement team. It's going to be a change that's affecting your caterers who are loading the product on a daily basis. It's going to be a change for your onboard crew members. And this is where we all become somewhat disconnected because we all work in different groups and different silos on different times. So the disconnect is, we can make all the changes in the world, but without the communication to the front line and caterers, the in-flight teams, the procurement teams, these changes will not be successful. These changes have to happen in parallel. There's different timings that are going on. With, you've got your design team. Maybe if it's part of a brand refresh, maybe you're looking for a brand new product. It's not something that's off the shelf. You're working with a design team in a different location, maybe in a different time zone. So maybe they're, needing 6 months just on the design effort. So you've got to start planning well in advance for these changes. Maybe it's a change in your supply chain, or it's a change that affects your supply chain planning. You've got to start burning off products. Maybe you're going to discontinue a product, so you've got to start burning off existing and prepare for the new. You've also got to start thinking about the timeline. When should I start ordering the new to have it on the shelves to be ready to go by the go-live date? You've also got your crew instructions, your in-flight operations team. These are your ambassadors on board, for the onboard experience. They're the ones that are going to be kind of selling the products to the customer, whether it's a business class meal. The customer's asking, I don't really know, what would you recommend? Would you recommend the chicken or the beef meal? You want to make sure your crew members are well educated on the offerings that you have on board. You want to make sure that education comes not too early so that it's, fresh in the minds of the crew members, but not too late so that you get their buy-in and you feel like they're a part of the team, part of the changes that are happening. You also want to make sure that you're looking at the reporting and the analytics, making sure that you're making decisions based on data, making sure that you're looking at seasonality. Some items do better at different times. So you want to make sure that as you're looking at these changes, how does your ordering, is there going to be a route change? Are you going to start slowing down? Maybe you're doing five flights to a specific station, but it's going to drop to 3, which would then go back and affect your planning team. So all of these, again, it's going to require coordination. It's, and these things are only going to become slightly more complicated as our world changes. Right now, we work in a world where we're loading, to the max, or we're loading for specific routes. But what if we enter into the world of allowing customers to do pre-order or pre-selection so that they can go ahead and tell us what they want? How are we going to make those changes on the fly? We're talking about these problems, and these problems might come to us once a quarter, once a month, maybe biannually. But what if we're doing it on a daily basis? Wouldn't it be cool if there was a technology out there that would, allow us to, make some changes, do some what-if scenarios? What if I were to add this bowl? How many bowls would I need based on my route schedule that's coming up over the next 6 months? What if this bowl happens to weigh 2 ounces more than the existing bowl? What's the cost for doing that? What am I going to spend in the fuel burn as these things go out? You've also got your menu development team. How many menus are these bowls associated to? How many, galleys are these bowls loaded into? Procurement, they're looking for, how many do I order? And then the asset management team is coming right behind it. How many do I order, but where do I ship them? Making sure that if you need to have them at, 20 locations by a certain date, that they arrive at those locations. Also making sure the health and safety concerns are addressed. Is this bowl suitable for food and beverage? Has it passed safety inspections, in the various countries that you're flying into? Maybe it's got, weight restrictions based on how you've packed it. So maybe you're working with your cabin crew on the safety aspects of it, so that if you put it in a drawer and the drawer weighs at a certain amount, you've got to start putting it below the waist instead of above the waist. You've also got engineering. They're looking at the weight and balance of the aircraft. Is this going to change the galley configurations, that we're using for the weight and balance of the aircraft? You've got your caterers. Your caterers are wanting to know, making sure that they have enough bowls, making sure that they're not going to run out, making sure that they've got stock from the inbound flights to cater the outbound flights. And then in the end, you've got your revenue management team that's always looking for ways to put additional people and additional space on board the aircraft, or additional selling mechanisms on board the aircraft. So they might be coming to you and saying, what, as part of this process, part of this change, we're going to go through and strip out a galley. So that's just one more metric that you have to put into play as you start planning for this is, okay, if we take out a galley, do I have the space? Do I have the weight? Does it fit within the weight restrictions for me to load these new products? And after all of this work, you look at it and you get complaints from your customers. They're saying, the bowl is too small, and it starts all over again. And we look at this process, and this process today is mainly handled through Excel spreadsheets and PDFs. So for each change, for each what-if scenario, you're having to go back and look at an Excel spreadsheet and go through the changes one by one, line by line, aircraft by aircraft, galley by galley, and make these changes. So again, it would be awesome if there was a technology out there that could go out and look at these changes, be able to publish these changes to your caterers with just the push of a button. Maybe log into a portal and they would see the changes, so they would know what's changed since the last loading. How is this going to affect my station? Maybe your crew members are looking to know, okay, there's a change happening. Maybe we can push a notification to the crew members and say, hey, today's the day. This is when the new meal is coming on, or the new bowl is going to be loaded. Look for it in this compartment. Maybe it's, your marketing team wanting to do what if. What if we do this, but what if we do this but don't do that? You could run these scenarios and not take days and weeks of analytics to go through this. What if it was just, a technology behind it and get off of the Excel spreadsheet? And that's where eGate Solutions is moving to. We're looking for a technology mechanism that allows the user to use technology to their advantage to increase or to achieve those customer expectations as they rise and as the technology starts changing in our world of onboard services. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Simon.
Great. Many thanks, Tina. So certainly, we have a pretty clear point of view on how we think, operations and loading work. And partially, I think the question for us is with balancing so many of these items and so many of these technologies, what's the sort of path through here? And how do we really change how we think about these kinds of questions in these operations to really get us to a place where we can compete effectively and not at a massive cost on in-flight experience and really the cabin environment. And so really what we see is, what's the map that we're going to draw through all these items and the integrations and the processes and the technology that get us to a place of having merged back office and frontline operations. And so, I always like this graphic because the question for me is mentally, what of these components do I have to draw up, right? So if we think about something like an IATA NDC, where we see a lot of activity on merchandising platforms and a lot of activity trying to understand how we're going to put rich product like pre-order or pre-select meals, let's say, into the agency channel. And there's certainly some people who are ahead on this, but really that's a connectivity that's on the front end of the process only. So we see kind of the ability to buy these components, but then when we ask the question, how are we planning on fulfilling these things in the carrier? How are we connecting up that travel agency with their technology and all of the customer support that goes along with it, and the shopping cart into the execution piece on the airplane? And those are maps that we sort of look at and don't necessarily feel have been really drawn all that effectively yet. And it gets compounded when we look at growth carriers, let's say, where the complexity, frankly, of those manual processes, of the way they're handling this and what worked necessarily, maybe as a smaller or a lower cost carrier, simply don't work. When you increase the scale, or as we're seeing actually with many of our smaller carriers or startup carriers or growth carriers, where they're increasing the level of service and adding services, it tends to break the model in a really fundamental way, and you actually can't draw the map all that effectively between all these items. The same is really similar. Same thing for our larger full-service carriers or traditional carriers who've maybe been around for a lot longer, where they've got a large full-service complementary model. They might have blended in retail, but those are entirely separate processes. So when we think about getting something from the warehouse to the stomach for retail, it's vastly different process, vastly different team, vastly different technology typically for a complementary program. And so those are some of the things that we really look at and say, okay, we're going to get to a place where we can take the back office and the functionality we have in the back office and operations and catering and in-flight management and bring them on board and enable sort of frontline operations. Those are the parts of connectivity that we have to get right. There's a second whole series of evolutions and trends here, which is on the technology side, and where we look at it really as convergence that are touching these things and playing with them. So, as part of this, we're seeing some carriers really effectively use technology to their advantage to start stringing these components together and to figure out how they're going to execute on it. And certainly in many marketplaces, we're seeing haves and have-nots. So people that have taken some of this technology are driving convergence inside of their own four walls and using it competitively. Some of those trends, and we'll talk through a couple of them now, are sort of much bigger. They're technologies that are impacting a lot of different things. Some of them have been around for a while. So when we look at something like the Internet of Things, which has been much discussed, where we have devices and sensor technology that can sit on the other end of a network and provide us with data. We're not seeing a lot of uses for those things yet, but they're coming, and we're seeing an acceleration. So for us, what's the opportunity to create that Internet of Things on board in our warehouses, in our supply chain, to really understand sort of quality of product, inventory of product, things that are maybe high value, how their journey was through the supply chain. Certainly, sensor technologies continue to improve and evolve, and we're seeing lots of great use cases, especially in the above the wing sort of food universe, where we can manage food safety a little bit with sensor technologies and enable crew to understand the quality of the supply chain that got their product there and whether it's safe or not. The issue, of course, is that all of these sensors and these endpoints require really great core technology. So there's no point in being able to attach RFID tags or sensors to things to understand where they are if you don't have the technology that actually enables you to know where they are. Sort of a weird catch-22. The next one is really around data sets. So people talk a lot about big data, and I think we look at this as being, with large data sets, how do we really use what we know? And that's really about the individual as well as the aggregate. So we look at things like pre-order, pre-select. That's a great and fundamental way to also understand kind of choice and understand patterns in people's behavior. And we can certainly use that at the individual level. If we've got a series of passengers whose order history we know, we can use that to sort of push forward and predict and maybe optimize uplift. But the reality will be that that's not going to be necessarily the majority of passengers to start with. And so how do we take some of that information and combine it with our wastage information, our ordering information, our uplift information, to get an aggregate view of passengers and start making some predictions on uplifts based on that? And so what are those data sets that we are going to connect together that we think are valuable? Certainly complementary and retail data, and beginning to push that together is an area where we see really fundamental value. The retail side of the world has really taught us what it's like to have great consumption information aboard, and so how we combine those things, I think, are really point to a value that we could generate. The other effort we're seeing actually is around the airport and the day of operations, where when we can combine all of the activity around an aircraft, from cargo to aircraft movement, to all of the activity that in our world we schedule for people to prep an aircraft, whether it's loading of catering or product or cleaning and all these kinds of things. As we're seeing more and more pressure on turnaround times and gate activity, especially in some North American markets where we've seen carriers fully rebank their hubs, peak and trough models, becoming even more important to understand this data and to use it effectively. There's a third one where we do see a lot of conversation and activity around CRM, and it's obviously a place where we've made great strides. Certainly on the loyalty side, we've been ahead of the universe, frankly, for a long time. But where we're not necessarily, I think, having the right conversations, how are we stringing together data from across the passenger experience? And how are we taking CRM well beyond just kind of the point interaction about flights and maybe some selection criteria to how someone is traversing the system from purchasing a ticket or researching it through to the arrival end of their journey? And so where we're seeing some clients begin to do that, they're seeing real payoff in terms of managing and promoting personalized experiences through that journey. The fundamental model to deliver this, though, is how do we get the supply chain in order and integrated at a level where we've got some flexibility? I mean, in Cena's bowl example previously, there's an additional layer to all of that, which is how do we actually get the supply chain to have the right amount of those and have them on place and be able to do it quickly and introduce it and test it? We certainly see models from other industries that we think point the way. If we look at something like the automotive manufacturing world, where over the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a really fundamental change in how manufacturers are integrated with their suppliers across all of the tiers of suppliers. And they made a very fundamental transition. They moved from sort of the world we're in today, where we tend to hold quite large inventory loads. We have a lot of buffer stock. They moved into a place where they really interconnected quite deeply through a series of standards with their suppliers and requested that their suppliers really manage inventory down to almost zero buffer stock. And it gave them a level of flexibility and cost efficiency they've never been able to manage. And it was beneficial for everyone. Certainly the manufacturers were able to manage and hold less inventory. They were also able to really be much more flexible in how they changed product and how they changed their goods that they were putting into the manufacturing process. But then also for suppliers, you had a very direct connection into your customer, and you had a really great sense for what they were going to need and when they were going to need it. And so for everyone, it really smoothed out this process and made it much more transparent. There is a question, which is how are we going to do that in our industry? We certainly see the catering universe, as well as all of the vast number of suppliers that are supplying product or services across the chain, really all working on vastly different models. And so to get this to a place where there's sort of some level of slickness will require a much deeper way of integrating and interconnecting our supply chain. And frankly, it's not a difficult technology challenge. It's perhaps one that we haven't taken on appropriately yet. The next big one is really when we look at mobile enablement. So I think when people talk about mobile, we sort of automatically jump into, there's lots of devices out there, and crew and passengers are going to have them, so we've done our mobile enablement test. Certainly that's part of the equation, but there's a lot more to it, right? So we've seen a fundamental series of changes over the last 5 years where the cost of applications, so the cost to develop interesting applications with functionality on a device are becoming much, much cheaper, and that cost continues to go down. And the cost to distribute them is gone down. And that's maybe even the more interesting point here, is that if you think about what it would take you 5 or 8 years ago or 10 years ago to put an application out, if you think about carriers that distributed scheduling applications, let's say 10 years ago, the cost to do that was massive compared to what it is today. That's simply going to decrease as well. Because of that, though, the cost for end users to switch is incredibly low. So where users see sort of limited value in an application or had a bad experience with the application, they're simply moving on very, very aggressively, very quickly. And it's because their expectations are extraordinarily high. You're putting an application into an ecosystem for a crew member or a passenger, frankly, where there's lots of other applications that they can use sometimes to see the same functionality. And part of what becomes really fundamental here is how are we curating partnerships and application alliances to deliver more functionality. Certainly recently, we've seen clients sort of jump into Uber's new APIs and start to use that as part of their apps. There's a couple of examples globally where people are doing that. And that simply has to continue, and the integration probably needs to become deeper, but it's a way to create interconnections on the ecosystem of your client's device that are of value. And the final point to this is, if we look 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, at really initial forays into self-service and the initial sort of phone self-service where we had, IVR and voice response doing service, people hated it. It was a pretty negative experience for many, except in some really specific use cases. And now what we look at is when we see applications that are usable and they work well, just even like mobile check-in, customers really love self-service, and they love it when it's done right. And so all of that really rolls into mobile enablement. So costs going down, distribution is cheaper, expectations are high, and you need to have friends. All sounds great, but the question is that, how have you service enabled this to happen? So applications are cheap, but exposing enterprise functionality is pretty costly. And I think you can just look at the initial efforts to enable things like mobile check-in, which were pretty costly for a lot of carriers that weren't investing in a new tool while they were doing it, as really an example of, if it was cheap to build the front-end application, what was deeply expensive was integrating the back end. So, it might be easy for us to expose some of the supply chain items onto the device, but getting the supply chain connected to get connected together is pretty costly. So, service enablement becomes a question of how are you going to do it in a really pointed way, and how is the development going to get focused to expose really key functionality in the right way. And partially to do this, we're seeing a shift in thinking from outsourcing some of these things and outsourcing some of these services, whether it's in enterprise service enablement, whether it's in the supply chain activity or in technology, into really looking for ways to consume slightly narrower managed services that are pointed, thin functional efforts, and they tend to package both the technology and the services. And that's been a change, certainly in the vendor community, that's enabling some of this. Technology at the end of the day, though, is just an enabler here. The market, consumer, and business pressures is the real driver here. And when we look at our industry, there's been a lot of focus on distribution, pricing, revenue management over many years, and that's been a real area of investment focus, and capital has been going there at a pretty deep level at most of our clients. That is shifting a little bit. We're seeing much more focus on in-cabin. We're seeing much more focus on the passenger experience. It's not that the other items are sort of, the battle's not over there. It's just a détente. And the pressure here is really ramping up, especially as we often talk about, the growth of the Middle East carriers, growth of sort of mid-service carriers. Those are what's driving so much of this and making this a battleground. The reality is that in addition to that, consumers have fundamentally changed and ramped up their expectations, and their expectations for things like personalization. So certainly we see, yes, everyone has a device. Yes, they're using them. Yes, the number's going to grow. But within that, though, there's a couple of trends that we need to really sort of look at as being part and parcel of this, which is that day in, day out, clients, whether they know it or not, and then consumers, whether they know it or not, are reaping the benefits of sort of really deep personalization, and personalization in a way that's sort of not intrusive and not necessarily freaking people out, but providing them with value. Whether you look at on the core retail side or closer to our industry in places like the hotel industry, where there's quite a few brands that have really deep experience in managing what they know about people and providing them with a personalized experience in a way that's not incredibly costly, and doing it in a really positive business value sort of way. So, this is out there and it's happening to us, and we're simply part of this, whether we realize it or not. There's a sort of a story and a lesson to be learned here as well, which is that adding applications on the front end without the back end integration never tends to really be a great story for people. So if we look at an example, and pre-order and pre-selection is really top of mind for us right now. It's really a competitive differentiator, and it's obviously part of this sort of personalization that we're talking about. But the reality is if it's simply an order system, and that's pretty easy to do from a technical and a process perspective, getting the order is the easy bit. The question is, how are we going to execute on it, and how are we going to push this into our universe to make it work seamlessly? I always use the example and ask people, when was the last time you saw a vegetarian not get their vegetarian meal? It's a pretty miserable experience. With something like pre-order and pre-selection, we're offering up that experience to many, many people, and we're offering up, frankly, the opportunity or non-opportunity to have a service failure. And so while we can create an application cheaply there, while we can kind of put it out there and offer it pretty cheaply, without the heavy lifting in the background to do some integration work, this becomes a really difficult area, and an area, frankly, where we can see some failure. Also, even without the failures, if we look at pre-order and pre-select right now as it stands, state of the art tends to be a 12-hour before departure sort of SLA. Most people are 24 hours. That's still a ways off from where other industries are in terms of their ability to very quickly execute on their supply chain and deliver things to customers. So we look at this as a really clear example of where all of these technology components, all of these kind of issues need to get strung together for this to work appropriately and properly. It's not an overwhelming technical challenge in many respects, but there is effort here. So what do we see as sort of key success factors and how to get moving on these things in an appropriate way? Certainly intelligent integration becomes one of our sort of fundamental tenets here. And, the reality is we've seen many clients, many industries, many companies sort of start with a really fully universal approach. So we're going to create some way of integrating all this stuff together up front really, really quickly. And we've seen a lot of efforts there that even when they're successful tend to be very, very costly and not necessarily get to the end result. Where we're certainly seeing clients being really successful here and seeing other industries where people have been successful is they're creating universal strategies, they're creating integration roadmaps, they're really prioritizing functionality, and when and where they think they're going to need it, and when and where they're going to need to expose it to their mobile applications or to people across the supply chain, and then they're working piece by piece from there. And it's a shorter, sharper, much kind of more focused way and a cost-efficient way of doing it. And it leads us directly into execution, which is where we're seeing kind of very, very large projects that are big, broad, and bulky. We tend to see certainly much higher risk. And so, short, sharp phasing, small functional releases, designing and doing the discovery work up front, and then taking an integrated approach beyond that really drives execution. And that's obviously where having the right partners, having the right sort of team structures across the organization is fundamental. This isn't an IT problem. It's not a catering problem. It's not an operating problem. It's really a cross-functional problem, and it needs to be treated like that from an integration perspective. On the data side, I think there's a lot of people talking about big data. It's probably almost cliche to even mention it these days in a tech presentation, but we look at it and say that there's many, many uses and many places where we can start to use some of these concepts in a fairly reasonably priced way to even just begin down the roadmap of personalization in a sort of an automated and a rules-based way. So simple initial uses of concepts from the big data world to validate and understand where there's value. How do we take data we know and tune gently optimizations, tune the rules that we drive an uplift with to get to both a better personalized experience as well as a far more optimized uplift. So that's a great starting point, and there's many places you can take it from there. Certainly in our own world right now, we're doing a lot of work on combining those items and figuring out correlations and combinations of data, but this is a great simple way to start. I think the final one for us is really continuing to understand and track kind of how this stuff is all moving. So, on the device side, applications, how vendors and technology firms and processing firms are actually selling and moving these things is changing. The networks themselves continue to change. And look, these are going to still continue to impact us. And if we look at mobile, we look at applications, how people think about them, they change day by day and week by week, even in the last few months with last month with Apple's Watch announcement and their near-field payments and connectivity stuff. Those are going to change, how we have to think about some of the applications on board and how we treat them, whether we like it or not, because they're out in the marketplace and people are going to start using this component. Keeping up with this stuff becomes a really fundamental and important item. So for us then the question, of course, is if we feel these things are all important and we look at all of these as kind of core trends that we need to be tracking, what are we doing from an eGate perspective and where are we taking our products? So what's our reaction? How are we putting our money where our mouth is? There's a number of things we're working on across the products and across the portfolio, and we're going to spend more time on our user webinar talking about some of these things and driving into a couple of them. But what are we doing here to really make sure the products are addressing these things and helping clients with it and, frankly, remaining relevant? So the first one is really making sure that we're working on functional integration across the products. And so that's both a user experience question, but also a shifting of focus, frankly, from a product stance to a functional solution. So when we look at pre-order, pre-select, it's really a functional solution that cuts across all of our products, from asset management, galley planning, to the above-the-wing management tool set, to our onboard tools. And all of those need to be sort of strung together and functionally integrated so that we can support that appropriately. And that's something we've spent a lot of time on, certainly in 2014 and in 2015. It will continue to be a real core focus of ours. To do that, we've invested really deeply in a new sort of modern open architecture that allows service enablement in shorter, sharper ways and in much sort of simpler ways, allows us to integrate other applications, whether they're ours or not, frankly, to really begin to allow a mix and match of tools that we feel are sort of key to integration with clients, because certainly we think of ourselves as an integrator in many respects, but also allow us to change how we think about delivering these products to clients, not as products, but as slices of functionality that are maybe even narrower than we were able to do a year ago. So in our case, this architecture is allowing us to take our IFX products and serve it up in much thinner slices where people see the value, they can only consume those components. The next one is really rebuilding the cabin and back office retail applications. So I think traditionally, many of these applications, people really thought of them as payments applications. And I think certainly, we look at payments as important. They're part of the workflow, but they're a step in a much broader series of workflow components on board. And they're only part of the back office activity that gets us ready for the onboard experience. And so when we go back to Sina's problem statement, being able to take all of that data and push it into the cabin appropriately, in some ways is just as important as the payment. Certainly we have to be able to do the payment, but it's part of a much larger workflow. The second piece of that is the catering and complementary workflow and the retail workflow are pretty darn similar, but driven by different logic. And so making sure that we've got the ability to integrate those things, to integrate things like pre-order pre-selection in them in a really simple way becomes very fundamental. So you'll see from us here in the next 2 or 3 months a new retail platform and payments platform and cabin platform that will continue to evolve in 2015. And we've already talked a little bit about it. Pre-order pre-selection is something that's really hot on our minds right now. And it's a solution that cuts across all of our products. In the next 2 or 3 months, we'll have some public announcements on a standalone platform, but it's also really an integrated piece that works across all of our products and is integrated to them in a way that we think solves some pretty fundamental issues in the market right now. And then wrapping all of this has been making sure that we have a business intelligence platform and a series of reporting and tools that allow our clients to play around with data and to play around with data in a way that is sort of useful for them and simple and requires or allows business users to really drive those reports and the ability to play with data to optimize it. So those are some of the components we're working on. We're certainly focused on a few other product roadmap items. As I said, in the user webinars and the user sessions, we're going to dive into a couple of these, as well as some of the functional implications of all these items. So we invite certainly everyone to join that if you've got time, if you're a user, and we'll hope those are interesting sessions for everyone. So that's the end of our prepared content. We certainly thank everyone for joining. I'm wondering if there's any questions or comments anyone has. So if you've got anything, please just add it into the Q&A queue here, and we'll bring it up. So I'll give everyone a minute just to answer anything. All right, so it looks like I've got just one question that's popped up, which was, what's a concrete example of what you called bringing the back office on board? So I think, for us, certainly there are a couple of examples, which are simple things like where we've got product on an aircraft for a specific reason or a specific promotion, or even just the general uplift load that we're putting on an aircraft, really enabling flight crew down to the deepest level to understand that uplift and understand what's on board and why it's on board. And there's one example that we've been talking a little bit about lately, which is on food tagging, where in the back office and in the catering world, we have a pretty deep understanding of ingredients. We have a pretty deep understanding typically of what allergen components those ingredients might have. But certainly right now, I don't think we have a lot of good mechanisms to get that data to flight crew, other than slapping stickers on food for key allergens. So we see that as a pretty good use case of this concept of bringing the back office on board, where flight crew should have some level of visibility into what catering already has, in a systematic way to provide them with that info. So we think that's probably a pretty good example of this concept. So with that, guys, I don't see any other questions popping up. If there are no other questions on the phone, we thank you for your participation. We thank you for your time today. And we'll certainly hope to continue the conversation through these webinars, both the public as well as the user reports. So I thank you for your time today, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation.